Hey everyone, welcome back to the hardware news recap for the week. In this one, we'll be talking about Intel bringing some new HEDT CPUs to market. First time since the 10980XE, not counting the 3175X. And if you're new here, that's pretty much the language we use. It's numbers and then there's an X somewhere in between. We'll also be talking about NVIDIA and rumors of a 4070, looking like possibly April for that. It's going to be expensive. And then Samsung 980 and 990 Pro firmware updates. If you're not aware of that story and you're using a Samsung drive in those classes, that's going to be an important one to pay attention to. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and their new Series 500TG ARGB mid-tower case. The Thermaltake series case is perforated all on the front panel and the power supply shroud, including perforations on the cable side of the case for further ventilation to the PSU and hard drive chamber of the case. A separate access door for hard drives makes the case easy to work with for 3.5-inch storage, or the door can be swapped out for a separate LCD panel kit that displays system information. Other features include a GPU support kit, vertical mounting, and a hinged glass panel. Learn more at the link in the description below. First off, Intel is getting ready to launch its Sapphire Rapids version of HEDT CPUs, or high-end desktop. Now, this is technically, it's an announcement of an announcement. So the announcement that we are doing right now is announcing the announcement of a future announcement that will announce some details for the new HEDT parts that are to be announced. So for this, it's on the 15th of February for the announcement of the announcement, and I think that's the appropriate level of recursion. I haven't double-checked the math, but it's about right, plus or minus one announcement. Technically, there's not much detail on these CPUs yet, but there was a leak previously that suggested some things like core counts and some of the speeds. So on Twitter, 9550 Pro posted a mainstream workstation CPU leak, referring to them as the W2400 SKUs. They range from 6 to 24 cores. They boost to 4.8 gigahertz on the high end, and they run 4 DDR5 channels with the ECC support. There's also 64 PCIe 5.0 lanes. Second will be the expert workstation CPUs, as they're being named, and these are the W3400 SKUs. These range from 12 to 56 cores, competing most directly with Threadripper, and they boost up to the same clock speeds. They have 8 memory channels instead, though, and then run 112 PCIe lanes. Now, if this announcement is worthy of announcing, hopefully we're going to get some high-end CPUs that'll be good for liquid nitrogen overclocking, because some of them are supposed to be unlocked. Intel hasn't done that, again, since either the 10980XE, which is like 2019 or something, or the 3175X, which was more or less, as cool as it was more or less instantly irrelevant because it was so low volume and there weren't that many motherboards either, plus everything was extremely expensive. So we're hoping to do some LN2OC with it. We'll see where it goes. But either way, CPUs like these are holistically harder to benchmark because we do our standard production benchmark suite. We'll throw some games in with it, but it's not the focus. The question for you all that we'd like to see answered in the comments is, what, in addition to our standard production suite, might you want to see tested on core counts up to, say, 56 on these CPUs, where they're clearly targeted at a workstation user? So this is more direct competition with Threadripper Pro 5000 series, but AMD's kind of been in and out of the Threadripper market since Intel basically abandoned HEDT for years. So at this point, we want to hear, what applications are you interested in seeing tested? It would be helpful to us if you give us a little bit more than, say, we've seen this one a lot, but I'm an audio engineer. I would like to see audio engineering benchmarks. Great. Please tell us what software you'd like to see tested. We can do some research from there. Same thing with compile testing. If you have a certain code base you know is public domain or open source that we can use, things like that. We don't need all the details, but enough to point us in the right direction. And then we can add those tests for these CPUs. Now, for desktop CPUs, AMD has pushed mainstream desktop to 16 cores with the 3950X and more recently 7950X. Intel is up there as well. With the 13900K, for example, we're now up to 24. So the raw core count's going up, but that's part of why HEDT has been absent. The special part of HEDT, though, is typically higher memory channel count and more PCIe lanes, which we're getting with these according to the announcement leak of the announcement. So for W2400 and the W3400 series CPUs, they're going to run on motherboards that run a W790 chipset. It's a Z790 family, basically, except the W indicates workstation. and probably almost certainly at this point a different socket than what we've seen on any of the current Intel motherboards as well, except maybe Sapphire Rapids. The only photos we have of one of these boards is from a December leak originating from the Chip Health forums. That leak is long gone at this point, but the images are still up on video cards. It's a massive 13 by 12 inch board from Supermicro with 6 PCIe Gen 5 by 16 slots, 4 M.2 slots, and 16 DDR5 DIMMs, allowing for an insane amount of RAM, more similar to its servers rather than traditional HEDT. So that's a big change, and it's been since the end of 2019 when Intel released Cascade Lake CPUs, and then obviously Threadripper kind of kicked Intel's ass. So this launch will be something of a return to form for Intel if it's able to pull through. Next up, there's a new leak on video cards indicating a potential 4070 launch in April. So this is not the TI. I already talked about the TI leaks. This is a non-TI, probably still going to be expensive though. The document that video cards posted is an embargo document. These are typically distributed to board partners and to OEMs, and then those partners use it as a guideline of when are they allowed to talk to press, when are they allowed to start doing marketing publicly. So that's what an embargo document is. As for the release date and the info, there's not much other than they're targeting on-shelf availability in April, and the dates for the product announcement and for the review publication timeline itself, both of those are marked as TBD at this time. The 40 series doesn't have any cards that we'd call mid-range yet, with the lowest being the 4070 Ti for $800 to $900, so still really expensive. That doesn't give us a lot of hope for the 4070 non-Ti, at least not to come in at a palatable price point. Along with the high end, the price class of 70 class NVIDIA GPUs has gone up a lot since the GTX 1070 in 2016, which had an MSRP of $380, or for the inflations at NVIDIA like Jensen Huang, that'd be $468 adjusted for inflation in today money. So with that inflation adjusted price, still basically double. Definitely some price creep is built in there. That is far more than inflation. There are leaked specs for the 4070 non-TI floating around online. At this point, we're going to stay away from them. We like to wait till it's a little closer to launch, so the leaks are more likely to be accurate. Whereas right now, it's far enough away, some of these numbers might change, so we're just not going to bother repeating them. If you care, though, I'm sure you could go type in 4070 rumored specs and then proceed to do nothing with that information anyway, because we just need to see benchmarks. But it's out there. We're just skipping that part. April, though, it sounds like is the timeline to look for. Up next, Samsung. So the 980 and the 990 Pro, if you hadn't heard, have had some issues lately with dying and data loss. Kind of a problem for SSDs. Samsung's been experiencing this for a couple of months now for its flagship SSDs. The 980 Pro and the 990 Pro M.2 SSDs specifically are the ones that we've seen problems for online. And a lot of you have actually messaged us, tweeted at us, asking us to cover this issue. But for instances where we don't test that category of product regularly, like SSDs, where we no longer test them, we'll basically just cover it in news and that's it, because we're not tooled up for it, and we also just don't have the skill set to just jump in randomly and start testing SSDs to then confidently stand behind a bunch of data. So we do have updates for you though, so that's the important part. Samsung has released a firmware update for the older 980 Pro. There's no update yet for the 990 Pro, but look out for one because there will be one. And what you should do is first, if you have one of these SSDs, check the health status of your drive. You can do this either using the freely available Samsung Magician software, which they distribute on their website, or you can use third-party tools like Crystal Disk Info. If you're not aware, there's something called Smart Stats for hard drives. All hard drives, well, and solid-state drives and flash drives have an attribute that indicates the health of the drive to a decent level of accuracy. And you can use this tool to see the degradation of the SSD and if it's at risk of dying anytime in the near or imminent future. And if so, you definitely need to get the firmware update on there immediately. As for users of the newer 990 Pro SSD, you'll have to wait a little longer. There's no update ready at the time of writing. However, a moderator on Samsung's EU forums posted the following, and the original text is in German, so this is machine translation. They said, quote, Samsung is currently reviewing customer requests for anomalies related to the smart percentage used on Samsung Magician or the Samsung SSD 990 Pro health status on Crystal Disk Info. We were able to reproduce the errors under certain conditions of use. To resolve this issue, Samsung is expected to release a firmware update in February. if you have a 990 Pro and the health attributes of the drive indicate that there may be cause for concern, we would recommend in the interim cloning the drive. There's plenty of software. Look up drive cloning software. Plenty available. We use Acronis internally. That costs money, but it's worked well for us. And pull all the data off, get a new drive, and then when you feel like it's safe to use again, if you do with the firmware update, you can go back to it at that point, but at least protect your data just in case there's some kind of imminent failure. Now, all this trouble has led to system integrator Puget dropping Samsung for the 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte capacities of its 990 Pro SSDs and 980 SSDs, and it has instead replaced them with Sabrent, which is a much newer arrival to the SSD space. Now, they're keeping the 512 gigabyte Samsung options in service because Puget says there's been no issues indicated with those. Up next, Raijintek has the new Forkis DDC pump block combo. You might be asking yourself, what's Forkis? That's what I asked too, and that's why it's in this news story. So Raijintek is launching this new pump block combo unit for custom water cooling, and the Forkis DDC Ultra, as the name indicates, not because of the Forkis part, but because the DDC part, uses a PWM DDC pump. This is more compact and provides more pressure than a D5, but it does so at the cost of increased noise output. The Forkis's Forkisar, I don't know, it's plural. The Forkisar use a POM or acetal body and a machined copper cold plate. It has nickel plating for the cold plate, and then for mounting solutions, it's what you'd expect at this point. Fits to LGA 1700 and AM5. It's actually a pretty compact unit though, so for sizing, it ends up running at about 80 by 84 millimeters. Feasibly, if you wanted to, you could build a loop using the Forkises, and I feel like I'm going to get demonetized, but I don't have a specific reason. Just YouTube's going to see that word and be like, I don't know what this is. Turn the ads off. But feasibly, you could do a loop without a reservoir if you used this. You would just have to be really careful and patient, and also set it up with a radiator that's top-mounted and has a fill port. But you could do it. Up next, ASRock's industrial branch is launching a new 4x4. It's not a vehicle. It's the 4x4 box. That's the name. I don't know. I guess we've run out of other ideas, so box is fine. It's a mini PC. These are aimed at commercial and industrial environments, and they use the new Ryzen 7000 CPUs, but not the desktop kind. They use the confusingly named mobile version of the Ryzen 7000 series. So specifically, these have the 7735U and the 7535U, but the 7000, it's not new Zen. This is older Zen. And, well, the name is just kind of confusing. AMD's new mobile naming convention is totally independent of the desktop parts. So we covered this previously, but this page from AMD explains it about as succinctly as possible, at least better than the decoder ring that AMD gave us at a press event previously. Despite the 7000 name, the third digit is the one that matters, and that's a 3 here, which means Zen 3. Anyway, the 4x4 box is available with either 6 or 8 core versions of the 28-watt TDP processors, and it can be configured with up to 64 gigabytes of DDR5 and SODIMM form factor. I/O is pretty light here. It runs 3 USB Type-A ports, 2 USB Type-C ports, some display outs, 2 Ethernet ports. One is 1 gigabit and one is 2.5. And internally, there's an M.2 and a SATA drive attachment that can be used for storage if you buy them separately. This isn't the most impressive mini PC we've seen recently, but we have seen a lot of mini PCs lately. This market seems to be growing right now. Minis Forum, for example, has gotten a lot more spread in the past year or so. Additionally, Intel's NUCs, they've been ramping up the production of those. So the market's getting pretty flushed with options for mini PCs. Previous generations of ASRock's 4x4s range from $480 to $800. They don't have a price out at the time of filming yet for this one, but we expect it to fall probably in that range. Microsoft has released a statement regarding an update from November causing issues with older versions of Intel graphics drivers in Windows 10 and 11. This applies to Intel's IGPs and CPUs, and technically Intel's discrete ARC cards as well, but we'll get to that in a minute. Microsoft's statement reads the following, quote, "After installing KB50199980, you might receive an error with apphelp.dll on Windows devices using Intel graphics drivers versions 26.20.100.7463 up to 30.0.101.1190. This issue might happen intermittently and affects apps which use DirectX or Direct3D to render part or all of their content. You have to respect the certainty they have there with it might happen intermittently, but DirectX, Direct3D is going to be most games at this point. And Microsoft is working on a solution to the issue, but there's also a workaround, at least for now. So the affected driver versions date back to December 2021 and before, but everything after then should be okay. And the important thing here is if you have an Intel Arc discrete GPU, those all came out after that point. There's not much reason you'd be running a GPU whose drivers predate the existence of that GPU, so Intel Arc dGPU users should be fine. So while this technically is applicable to discrete Arc GPUs, you don't need to worry about it here. It's the IGPs that matter. The bottom line is that if you're experiencing crashing in games or 3D applications with an error message mentioning apphelp.dll, you should check your driver version and then probably update it. For IGPs, you can check this easily in Windows by opening Device Manager. You can do this by clicking Start and then typing in devmgmt.msc, pop up Display Adapters, right-click the Intel Graphics option, and then choose Properties. Then you click the Driver tab. Up next, Watercool is making some more water blocks, because obviously, for the 40 series. So this is going to be the Heatkiller 5. It's become increasingly relevant to cover water cooling parts for custom loops because as the heat and the power consumption have gone up on these new components, now it's more than just I did water cooling because it's fun and it looks cool, and it becomes I did water cooling because it has a very practical use, which is reducing the noise levels. Unless you buy an Origin PC, but we'll talk about that later. The Heatkiller 5 Pro takes advantage of the Founders Edition's relatively compact PCB because it's small. It's not quite as thin as something like AlphaCool's one-slot Enterprise block, but it's still way thinner than any of the air-cooled designs. The in and out ports are located in the V-shaped area on the PCB, similar to EK's 30 series FE blocks. On the bottom side, you can actually see where the plexiglass has been drilled horizontally to allow the liquid to flow from the ports to the metal part of the block. The water goes from this intake down the cold plate fins and then cools the VRAM and the power stages on the way out. Watercool's parts usually adhere to an industrial aesthetic, and this block isn't really any different with its hard lines and plain metal cover plates. Following a recent trend in water blocks, the whole thing ends up wrapping around the PCB's edge, encasing it totally, and only letting a sliver of the plexi show through for lighting effects. And speaking of lighting, fortunately this block has a header on the end of the card, which feeds the internal LED strip. We like this a lot better than the usual approach of having a cable hanging out of the block at all times, because then it's just annoying if you don't want the lights, or it is just harder to route. For pricing, the Heatkiller 5 Pro is available in silver or black from Watercool's shop. It's 250 euros, including VAT. And there's also a listing for the Asus Strix or TUF alternative, but no price or photos at the time of writing this. This is a pretty quick one. 11th gen is dead. Intel's killing it. If you didn't know, it was still around. So Intel tends to put out these change notifications. They call them PCNs for, I think it's product change notification. And for February 6th, they are officially discontinuing the 11th gen CPUs, the ones that we called waste of sand. Now, if you missed the 11th gen and you want a quick recap of it, basically, several of the parts were regressive in performance versus the 10 series counterparts that came out earlier and sometimes cheaper than the 11th gen. It was pretty bad. The reason they regressed is because there were some in-silicon mitigations for, if you remember, Spectre and Meltdown and other exploits and vulnerabilities that were announced prior, and that slowed down the CPUs in a way that just didn't look too good in the charts. So anyway, they're killing this. This is normal. They do this with products as they start to phase them out entirely, obviously. And the PCNs, or the announcements of discontinuance, are a heads up for OEMs or for wholesalers who sell to retailers, and basically says, hey, if you want to buy it, get it now. Now, the warranties still apply, so if you have one, you're still covered there, at least if it's under the warranty at this point. And retailers will carry stock until it sells out, but otherwise they're not going to make them anymore, which they shouldn't have done it anyway, so that's fine. Moving on, a new NVIDIA driver feature is coming this month, RTX Video Super Resolution, We covered it in a previous news video, but as a quick flyover for a refresher, Video Super Resolution will enable users of 30 and 40 series RTX GPUs to locally upscale streaming video in the browser. This one's actually really interesting for a lot of reasons. So DLSS, FSR, RSR, we haven't tested XESS, but same class of software. All of these have been pretty effective in increasing the effective or the perceived resolution without the total absolute cost of rendering that resolution, that effective resolution. So bringing it to video makes sense. It should work mostly the same way in practice, or in theory at least. In practice, you're dealing with network delivered video feeds as opposed to locally rendered feeds. But the idea is that with YouTube, Twitch, or anything else where you're watching video playback, you might be able to now run at, say, 480p or 720p and get a perceived or effective resolution closer to maybe one class up. So from 720, maybe you get 1080, 1440. We're not sure the exact details yet, but they'll be talking about that soon, or we'll just download it and try it. Now, Google's Chrome, the latest release of it, does support this already. We assume other Chromium-based browsers like Edge will follow this, but you still can't try it quite yet because you're going to need to wait for GeForce driver version R530, which NVIDIA says is coming out later this month. This is coming from a member of NVIDIA staff on its own forums, so this is official information. The OC3D article we found this story through, though, claims that 20 series cards will eventually be able to do this as well, but we couldn't find additional sources for it, so we'll just have to try it out once it launches. Like we said originally, this is actually cool technology because it helps a lot in a few scenarios. One of them is bandwidth constraints. So if your ISP enforces some kind of cap on bandwidth consumption, this could theoretically help you drive down your total bandwidth consumed while hopefully not sacrificing too much of the quality you get. Another benefit is in areas where internet speeds just aren't that developed yet, like a lot of the area around us where there's still DSL 3 megabits per second. Yes, actually, it would be helpful there for the obvious reason. Drop the video feed to the normal resolution you can actually support on that internet connection. Thank you, Spectrum, AT&T, Charter, and everyone else in the US who makes it so great to work with. And then you just upscale it locally. But we'll test it out. This is one we actually want to use. Obviously, being in video, it's highly relevant to us, and if people can play our videos back without having to necessarily rely on all of the data coming down through YouTube and over the ISP, then even better, because now maybe you'll be able to read the charts if you're playing them at 360p. Last one, Gigabyte is one of the first major brands pushing PCIe Gen 5 SSDs, and this one is in the Aorus branding. They're calling it the Gen 5 10,000 because asterisk, sometimes it's 10,000 megabytes per second, and it would be awkward to call it 8,500 to 10,000. So they've gone with the higher number. Marketing deserves a raise. So the drive is actually pretty interesting. The 2 terabyte model is rated for 10,000 megabytes per second sequential read, which is insane. And then it also runs 9,500 megabytes per second sequential write. The 1 terabyte version falls a little short of that 10,000 mark. It runs at 9,500 megabytes per second read sequentially and 8,500 write. Gigabyte's being a little generous in the rounding for that name. The specs page doesn't list any of the random speeds though for 4K IOPS or anything similar, so we just have sequential. Obviously, that kind of speed is going to generate heat, and with video cards as big as they are, it can be a problem for an SSD shoved under one. It's clear that Gigabyte isn't playing around in this regard because this thing has a relatively massive heatsink strapped to it. They're calling it Thermal Guard Extreme. So if you buy a Gigabyte X670E motherboard, for example, maybe the X670E Extreme, it's an actual board. The E in X670E stands for Extreme with an E, and the Extreme stands for Extreme, but there's no E at the front. So it's the Extreme Extreme. And then you could plug in your new PCIe Gen 5 SSD, the PCIe 5000. Wait, that's not right. Sorry, the Gen 5 10,000 with the Thermal Guard Extreme, and then you'd have the X670 Extreme Extreme with Thermal Guard Extreme. And we're back to the announcements that are announcing announcements. So anyway, it has a large cooling solution, and they're doing this by using sort of an adapted VRM style heatsink on the SSD. It's 45 millimeters tall, it has 2 heat pipes going to a fin stack, like again you'd find on a high-end VRM, and it sandwiches the actual SSD with full cover thermal pads. Anyway, Gigabyte even provides a list of its own motherboards that are not compatible with the heatsink because of its size. It looks like an over-the-top solution, but if it successfully prevents the use of tiny, annoying fans, then we won't complain too much. On the technical side, the SSD leverages the zoned namespaces technique available in the NVMe 2.0 spec, which allows the SSD and the host system to collaborating on data writing across the drive. This helps performance and even wearing and wear leveling of the NAND flash. There's no pricing yet, but 10 gigabytes per second read, it's going to be high. We don't test SSDs, as stated earlier. We might test them for thermal reasons only, so maybe if there's time, we'll look into this just because I think the heatsink is interesting. But that's going to be it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. On the store, you can grab things like shirts, mod mats for PC building, toolkits, and coaster packs alongside other items, and it helps fund what we do here. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.